Saturday, the 21st of June, 2003. A children's football clinic at Cross Keys Reserve in the Melbourne suburb of Essendon. It's the school holidays. Kids are running drills on the oval. Parents are watching from the sidelines. Among them is a man named Jason Moran. He has brought his own children to the football. He's sitting in the front of a van with a family friend, Pasquale Barbaro, and there are children in the vehicle. A lone gunman walks up to the van. He opens fire into the front seats. Jason Moran and Pasquale Barbaro are killed where they sit, in daylight, at a children's sporting event, with kids close enough to hear it. The gunman runs. Security footage from a nearby hotel catches a figure fleeing, and then he's gone. For most cities, a double murder at a children's football clinic would be the crime of the decade. In Melbourne, in 2003, it was just one more body in a war that had already been running for years and was nowhere near finished. By the time it was over, more than 30 people would be dead. This was a war between drug traffickers and crime families for control of Melbourne's amphetamine trade. A war so brazen that men were shot outside their homes as they took out the bins, executed in restaurants over lunch, gunned down in pubs and car parks and driveways across the northern suburbs. It produced a task force, a television series that gripped the entire country, and one central figure, a chubby, smiling former supermarket shelf stacker named Carl Williams, who turned being underestimated into a weapon and murdered his way to the top of the Melbourne Underworld, and then died, beaten to death in his own prison cell, with the exercise bike still bolted to the floor beside him. This is the story of the Melbourne Gangland War. To understand this war, you have to start before Carl Williams mattered to anyone, with the man whose death lit the fuse. His name was Alphonse Gangitano, and in the Melbourne underworld of the 1990s, he was royalty. Born in 1957, Italian-Australian, from the leafy suburb of Templestowe, Gangitano was the face of an organization the press called the Carlton Crew, the established, old-school, largely Italian criminal network that had run Melbourne's inner north for years. He was handsome, charismatic, obsessed with the glamour of being a gangster, and modeled himself on the American mafia. The papers gave him a nickname he adored, the Black Prince of Lygon Street. At his peak, Gangitano was reportedly earning between $125,000 and $200,000 a month from nightclubs, fight promotions, protection rackets. But underneath the charm was a genuinely frightening temper. One night in December 1995, at the sports bar on King Street, Gangitano and his associate Jason Moran launched a brawl so savage it injured around 11 people. Gangitano attacking patrons with a broken bottle, pool cues swung at bystanders. That's worth noting because Jason Moran, the man beside him that night, belonged to the other great power in Melbourne's underworld, the Moran family. The two were associates, for now. By early 1998, Gangitano had become a problem. According to a later deathbed account from a Moran associate, he was going silly on cocaine, screaming about debts, becoming unpredictable and dangerous to the people around him. On the night of the 16th of January 1998, two men were at Gangitano's Templestowe home, his old friend Graham the Munster Kinneberg and Jason Moran. At some point that evening, Kinneberg left to buy cigarettes. When he came back about 30 minutes later, Gangitano was dead on the laundry floor, shot several times, inco, looting to the head. His wife was in the house. Nobody was ever convicted of the murder. A coroner later found that Kinneberg and Jason Moran had been present that night. Both were excused from giving evidence on the grounds it might incriminate them. Kinneberg kept his silence to the end. Years later, a dying Moran associate would claim it was actually Mark Moran, Jason's half-brother, who fired the shots. The exact hand on the gun almost doesn't matter. What matters is this. The murder of Alphonse Gangitano in January 1998 is the moment historians and police point to as the beginning. The established order had just killed one of its own, The Melbourne Underworld had shown it would eat itself. And out in the northern suburbs, a nobody was watching and learning. Carl Anthony Williams did not look like the future king of the Melbourne Underworld. Born in 1970, raised in Melbourne's working-class northern suburbs, he was a high school dropout, overweight, soft-spoken, unremarkable. He'd worked stacking supermarket shelves. People who met him underestimated him instantly, and Williams learned early that being underestimated was an advantage. He smiled a lot. He seemed harmless. He was, in fact, ferociously ambitious. Through the 1990s, Williams moved into the drug trade, and specifically into the product that was about to reshape Melbourne's underworld: amphetamines, speed, party pills. For generations, the established families like the Morans had controlled Melbourne's drug trade. But amphetamines were different, cheap to manufacture, wildly profitable, and open to any newcomer ruthless enough to muscle in. Williams manufactured, he imported, he undercut. By the early 2000s, his independent operation was reportedly generating enormous money. Some estimates put it in the tens of millions and beyond. He was, in the words of one writer, less a traditional mafioso than an entrepreneurial psychopath, a businessman whose business happened to be drugs and, soon, murder. And his rise put him on a collision course with the family that thought Melbourne's drug trade belonged to them, the Morans. They were underworld aristocracy. Louis Moran, the patriarch, a veteran of Melbourne's old crime scene, connected to the notorious Painters and Dockers Union. His sons, Mark Moran and Jason Moran. The same Jason who'd been in Gangitano's house the night he died. The Morans were established, violent, and deeply offended by this fat upstart from Broadmeadows selling cheap pills on their turf. The tension was building toward something, and on Carl Williams's birthday, it exploded. The 13th of October, 1999, Carl Williams' 29th birthday. He met with Jason and Mark Moran at a park in Gladstone Park, in Melbourne's north. The dispute was about money. The Morans believed Williams was undercutting them, selling amphetamines too cheap and cutting into their trade. The argument escalated, and Jason Moran pulled out a gun and shot Carl Williams in the stomach. Williams survived. That decision, to shoot him but not to kill him, would cost the Moran family everything, because Carl Williams did not go to the police. He went home, he recovered, and he started planning. What the Morans had treated as a warning, Williams treated as a declaration of war, and unlike them, he intended to win it completely, not to wound, but to erase. He later described his philosophy with chilling simplicity to those around him. He was going to kill them all. The first to die was Mark Moran. On the 15th of June 2000, Mark Moran arrived home in the suburb of Aberfeldy. As he got out of his car outside his house, he was shot dead. Carl Williams was later charged with the murder, a charge that was ultimately dropped only because he pleaded guilty to other killings. No conviction was ever formally recorded against him for Mark's death, but the picture that emerged from the underworld and the courts was unambiguous. The revenge campaign had begun, and the first Moran was in the ground. The war was on, and Carl Williams was about to find the perfect weapon. Around 2002, through a mutual associate, the drug trafficker Tony Mockbell, Carl Williams brought a young man into his inner circle. His name was Andrew Veniamin. Everyone called him Benji. Benji Veniamin was a former car thief from Sunshine in Melbourne's west, short, intense, gym-built, and utterly without fear. Police would come to regard him as one of the most dangerous and feared men in the entire Melbourne underworld. They suspected him of killing as many as 7 people. He was, by 2003, Carl Williams's right-hand man and chief enforcer, the trigger for the machine Williams was building. And the killings came fast now. The war spread beyond just the Morans into a tangle of shifting alliances and score settling. Underworld figures across Melbourne began dying. shot in cars and driveways in the street. A drug dealer named Nikolai Radev gunned down in Coburg in April 2003. Veniamin had met with him the very day he died. Others followed. The body count climbed so steadily that newspapers began numbering the victims: the 20th gangland killing, the 21st, the 24th. Then came the 21st of June, 2003. Cross Keys Reserve, the Children's Football Clinic. Jason Moran, the man who had shot Williams in the stomach and started it all, was sitting in a van with Pasquale Barbaro watching Jason's own kids play football. The lone gunman walked up and shot them both dead in the front seats. Killing Jason Moran in front of children at a kids' sporting event was a message. It said there were no rules left. It horrified the public, and it made the Melbourne Gangland War front-page news across Australia, no longer an underworld problem the city could look away from, but a war being fought in its parks and suburbs in broad daylight. The Moran family was being systematically destroyed. 2 of its sons were now dead. Only the patriarch was left. The double murder at the football clinic was a turning point for the killers and for the police. In response to the mounting bodies, Victoria Police had established a dedicated task force in 2003, Operation Purana. Their job was to end the Gangland War, to untangle who was killing whom, and above all, to get to the man they increasingly believed was orchestrating it. But the killing didn't stop for the task force. On the 31st of March, 2004, Louis Moran, the patriarch, the last of the Moran men, was shot dead in the Brunswick Club, a pub in Brunswick. The family that had ruled Melbourne's underworld, that had shot Carl Williams and thought that was the end of it, was now effectively wiped out. Mark, gone. Jason, gone. Louis, gone. Carl Williams had done what he said he would do, but even Williams couldn't fully control the forces he'd helped unleash, because the war had a logic of its own now, and it was about to take his own favorite weapon. The 23rd of March, 2004, around 2:30 in the afternoon, La Porcella, an Italian restaurant in Carlton, the old heartland of the Carlton crew. Benji Veniamin, Carl Williams' feared enforcer, walked into that restaurant to meet a man. A big man, a former heavyweight boxer, a Carlton crew figure, a man who by reputation stood on the opposite side of this war from Williams and Veniamin. His name was Mick Gatto. What exactly happened in that restaurant is known mainly from one man's account, because only one man walked out. Minutes after Veniamin arrived, he was dead on the floor, shot in the neck and the head. Gatto was charged with his murder. At trial, Gatto told the court it was self-defense. He said Veniamin had pulled out a .38 handgun and threatened to kill him, and that during the struggle, Gatto had managed to turn the gun back on Veniamin and fire. He also told the court that Veniamin, in their argument, had implicated himself in several underworld murders. Gatto was remanded in custody for about 18 months awaiting trial. In 2005, a Supreme Court jury found Mick Gatto not guilty. He walked free, acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, and remains alive today, a well-known Melbourne identity who built a later career as a mediator and businessman, and who has always maintained the killing was self-defense. For Carl Williams, the death of Benji Veniamin was a serious blow. He'd lost his most feared weapon, but by now Williams had bigger problems than losing an enforcer. Operation Purana was closing in. For all his cunning, Carl Williams had left a trail of bodies, of associates, of people who, once the task force applied enough pressure, could be turned. That's how these wars usually end, not in a shootout, but in an interview room. Purana detectives worked their way through Williams' network, flipping associates, building cases, and piece by piece they assembled the evidence to bring down the man at the center of it. Carl Williams was arrested and charged. On the 28th of February, 2007, in a deal that stunned Melbourne, Williams pleaded guilty to 3 of the gangland murders, the killings of Jason Moran, Louis Moran, and another man, Michael Marshall, as well as related offenses. In exchange, other charges, including the murder of Mark Moran, were dropped. He was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 35 years, Carl Williams would have been in his mid-60s before he could even apply for release. The smiling fat boy from Broadmeadows, who had murdered his way to the top of the Melbourne Underworld, was going to die an old man in prison, except he didn't get to grow old. By 2010, Carl Williams was an inmate at Barwon Prison in the high-security Acacia unit, sharing space with a small number of other high-risk prisoners. One of them was a man named Matthew Johnson. On the 19th of April 2010, in that unit, Matthew Johnson attacked Carl Williams from behind with the stem of an exercise bike, the metal seat post, torn from the equipment in the prison unit. He beat Williams to death with it. Carl Williams was 39 years old. The man who had ordered so many deaths, who had sat calmly through his own murder trial, who had beaten the Morans and buried an entire crime family, was himself murdered, bludgeoned to death in a locked prison unit that was supposed to be one of the most controlled environments in the country. Why? The theories have never fully settled. Williams, by the end, was believed to be cooperating with police, providing information in exchange for benefits, including reported arrangements involving his family. In the underworld, a man who talks is a man marked for death, and some believe Johnson killed him to stop him informing. Others point to prison politics and Johnson's own standing among high-risk inmates. Matthew Johnson was later convicted of the murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term of his own. Carl Williams's funeral was a spectacle, a lavish send-off for a man the city had watched rise and fall on the evening news for a decade. And his death, in that prison unit in 2010, is generally taken as the symbolic end of the Melbourne Gangland War. The king was dead, the Morans were gone, Gangitano was long buried, Veniamin was in the ground, the task force had done its work. The war was over. So what was it all for? Over roughly a decade, the Melbourne Gangland War killed more than 30 people. The Purana Taskforce believed Carl Williams alone was responsible for around 10 of those deaths. Many of the murders have never been solved, and at this point likely never will be. The men who could answer for them are mostly dead themselves. It's easy to tell this story as a thriller. It became one, a hit television series that had the whole country watching, that turned Alphonse Gangitano and Carl Williams and Benji Veniamin into household names, that made the Melbourne underworld feel almost glamorous. But strip the glamour away and look at the actual ledger. Alphonse Gangitano, shot dead in his laundry while his wife was home. Mark Moran, shot dead outside his house. Jason Moran, executed at a children's football clinic with kids nearby. Louis Moran, gunned down in a pub. Benji Veniamin, dead on a restaurant floor at 28. Carl Williams, beaten to death with a piece of gym equipment at 39. And more than 24 others, dealers, enforcers, associates, and the occasional person who simply got in the way. The prize they were all killing for was control of the drug trade. And the drug trade, of course, didn't end when Carl Williams died. It never does. New players filled the vacuum, as they always do. The same way, decades earlier and a state away, new criminals had firebombed their way into someone else's territory in Sydney. And the same way, years later, Melbourne would find itself fighting an entirely new kind of underworld war over cigarettes. The names change, the city changes, the product changes. The war never really ends. It just finds a new generation willing to kill for it. This has been the story of the Melbourne Gangland War.